This is Keys to the Shop, episode 361, Managing Roastery Logistics with Corey Turner of Andytown Coffee Roasters. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I am your host for the show, and thank you so much for taking the time to listen, and I would really encourage you to subscribe to this show as we put out a lot of episodes every month, and I really want you to be updated every time we come out with new content. All you do is hit subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast right now. And also, don't forget to share these episodes with a friend and let people know about Keys to the Shop. That really helps the show grow, gets these ideas out to more people, and I thank you for that. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about Keys to the Shop Consulting. This is where I get to work directly with you to help you either start your coffee business off on the right foot, or if you're an existing operator, help you level up your operations, quality, and people across the board in your cafe, and give you clarity and solutions on various projects and problems that you might be experiencing right now. There's a lot of different ways to work with Keys to the Shop Consulting, whether remotely or on site, and I would love to have a conversation with you about that. All you have to do to set up a free discovery call with me is email chris@keystotheshop.com, and we'll have a great chat about how Keys to the Shop Consulting can help you build a thriving business. Again, that email for Keys to the Shop Consulting, chris@keystotheshop.com. Now, one of the aspects of coffee roasting is we're going to be talking about logistics today. You know, the roastery wants to know that the coffee that they roast is going to be expressed properly on the bar. And one of the things that helps roasters sleep well at night is knowing that when their coffee is brewed on something like the ground control Cyclops brewer from Voga Coffee, it has a really good chance of being expressed in a fantastic way. The ground control brewer is absolutely revolutionizing what we all can expect from batch brewing. It's got SCA award-winning technology that allows you to have incredibly precise control over a broad range of flavors in the coffee, effectively opening up way more possibilities for each and every origin and blend. Not only is it a next level batch brewer, but it also makes tea, batch-sized lattes, batch cold brew, so this can increase your profitability, your efficiency and output, and also increase your quality. So check them out over at groundcontrol.coffee to learn more. I really think if you want your coffee to be expressed properly and also want to increase your cafe's efficiency at the same time, you really need to look at getting a ground control Cyclops brewer in your store. Again, the website, groundcontrol.coffee. Now, serving our customers well is what we are all about. We do this through coffee. We do it through coffee drinks that include milk and also plant-based beverages. And if you're looking for excellence in plant-based beverages, you don't need to look any further than the Barista series from Pacific. And this is the line of plant-based performance beverages that are designed for baristas from the beginning. And with the help of and feedback from the professional barista community around the globe, you'll know that this actually really performs on the bar the way it really should. Stands up to the heat from the steaming process. It creates wonderful foam, dense microfoam, perfect for latte art. And the balance of the final drink is focused on the coffee. Your customers are absolutely going to love it. Go visit them at pacificfoodservice.com. Get samples and try it for yourself. Let your team try it. So again, if you're looking for quality and want to serve your customers the best, I think it needs to be the Barista series from Pacific. Okay, everybody. Well, today we're going to be diving into the topic of logistics and basically creating an environment and systems in the coffee roastery that is going to not only serve your customers, but also the people that you are working with, your team in the roastery. And someone who does a really great job at this is Corey Turner, our guest today on the show. Corey has worn many hats in 18 years in the coffee industry, including barista, trainer, roaster, technician, apprentice. Originally from rural Virginia, Corey moved to the West Coast to pursue an MFA in poetry and to work in coffee, and currently works for Andytown Coffee Roasters in San Francisco, California, as the Director of Coffee Production and Logistics. And that work takes place with an amazing team where they scale the coffee menu, production and wholesale, and of course bear the standard of quality that Andytown is really well known for. And in our conversation today, we're going to talk a lot about the lessons that Corey has learned throughout the years of working in coffee that have led to creating the standards and systems that are so important in this particular role. How do you manage various needs of wholesale customers and cafes? What kinds of communication need to happen on a regular basis to keep things flowing smoothly? What happened when COVID hit? And now, how are things going? Managing demand, keeping on top of inventory and relationships, and everything in between. There's a lot of stuff that we cover, all related to the logistics and systems that go into running production at a roastery. And Corey brings a wealth of wisdom that's hard-earned, great insights that I think you're really going to benefit from. So I'm excited, of course, to share this conversation with you, and let's get right to it. Here now is my interview with the production and logistics director for Andytown Coffee Roasters, Corey Turner. All right, Corey, welcome to Keys to the Shop. Excited to have you here. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. Before we recorded, I mentioned that I don't think we've talked about this particular topic on the show specifically yet. And so I'm kind of excited to dive into the nuts and bolts of what's involved in logistics and, running a roastery and all that fun stuff. We've had a lot of roasting episodes, but nothing so, focused on this. And so I just kind of wanted to get a feel for your journey into this role and in coffee. So let's maybe start there and talk maybe how did your journey start? How did you begin in roasting and production in coffee?
Yeah, so I started as a barista back in Virginia when I was in college. I'd studied a lot at the shop that I ended up working at, and it just felt like a good community, and I was pretty over it and ready to graduate. So I was like, let's meet people off campus, and of course needed a job. And so from there, I became the trainer at that cafe and was running the coffee cart and events and, just all the odds and ends as one does. And then I moved here to San Francisco for grad school for an MFA in poetry. And I worked as a barista and a trainer again. And I think, like a lot of people, I started to feel frustrated with the divide between like trainers and production QC, and just felt like what I could do at the cafe level was limited by, managers who wanted people to be trained really fast, or coffees that could be roasted to make the dialing in process like simpler. And so that's kind of what made me want to learn how to roast. And then I got the opportunity to learn from a friend who I had previously worked with and who started at another coffee company.
Okay, so I want to zero in on what you mentioned, the divide between the trainer and the roasting QC, and talk a little bit more about that, because I think I know what you're talking about. There's always this kind of like front of house, back of house ecosystem that we all operate in, and we like to, blame the roaster or the baristas or, all that fun stuff. But from your vantage point, I mean, what was going on there that caused there to be that divide?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is just natural. Like, to some degree, it exists everywhere. I feel like the first few cafes I worked at, the Roastery was really this like exclusive place that like you couldn't access as a barista. You couldn't even be there. And the shop where I really started to realize like this is a problematic divide, the roaster was like in the same space as the cafe, and we were like friends with the roasters too. Like, they'd come up and get an espresso and they'd be like, oh, this isn't tasting right. And then we'd be like, well, we're using the parameters that we're supposed to be using. Like, what, we were doing our best to like make it taste good. And, it could go one way or the other, but I think it was just like we weren't meeting each other. it was kind of like they got really defensive about their roasting, and like the baristas would get really defensive about how they dialed, and there was no like shared cupping space or like any kind of like we had a really extensive log for tasting notes and things like that, like behind the bar, and I was a trainer for that cafe, so I managed all of that stuff, and we never like that never got back to them, so it was like we were putting all of that data into a vacuum.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, so it just felt kind of silly.
Yeah, that's frustrating. And so what was it specifically that made you want to take the step from being a trainer in the front to roasting? Was it that you wanted to do a better job to, bridge that divide? Was that even on your mind at the moment?
I mean, I think at the time I really just wanted to learn about it, but I do think I wanted to see like the other side of like the other variables that are involved in making coffee taste great, like on bar. I don't know. I've always had much more of a logistics brain. Like checking off tasks was really appealing to me. Honestly, that's nerdy, but it's true. Working in the roastery as soon as I started that, like felt a lot more natural.
So you've been kind of naturally bent towards like how things work, the details of the processes, and kind of fascinated with that. Is that something that's also, not to get too far off topic of coffee here, but you said you had an MFA in poetry, which at first blush, I think we would say, oh, well, that's interesting, because I wouldn't expect somebody who's like really into poetry to also be very logistical and process oriented. But what's the relation there? I think there must be something where your fascination with how things work and the inner worlds of those elements kind of plays into your disposition in the arts too.
Honestly, I think about that a lot. I feel like one of the best ways to sum it up is one of my professors in poetry back in the day. She had like a philosophy around flood subjects, is what she called them. And it's like when you're creating art, you need exposure to another field that's not just, the sort of vacuum of the workshop or the university environment. And so like, you could be a chemist and you end up having a lot of material to work with from chemistry to turn into poems. And so I think that's kind of honestly where it started, was just knowing that if I was exposed to like different things, I'd kind of have the thoughts of like, how are these things connected, and like how does this like translate back to the page? And I still think about it that way. I mean, I wrote a lot of poems about coffee, especially like in the times when I've been really actively learning something new.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you kind of break outside of your field a little bit, or just kind of get these disparate ideas connected, and it kind of shows you a little bit more of what's underneath the surface and what's going on, that you can impact something a lot more if you understand it from a lot of different angles, right?
Yeah, and I think it's also like, there's a relationship between, being in doing this activity that has no constraints, that like you have to kind of like decide what constraints you're going to impose to try and create something, versus like having a super structured environment. I mean, I guess in some ways, like, especially now, like I created the structure that we have in the department. So it's like, yeah, I guess you could really go deep and say that's a poem.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, your logistical frameworks are the rules that other people operate by to express themselves. So it's like the coffee version of English romance poems and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I mean, at a very base level, it's nice for the brain to like switch between those things and not always have this like blank canvas.
Talk a little bit about the discovery of how things worked once you went to learn about production and roasting. You had so much knowledge about the work of a barista, and as a trainer, you can empathize with the people you're training, and now you're stepping behind the curtain, so to speak, and learning about this other world. What was that learning curve like for you?
One of the big differences was moving to more task-based, or yeah, like a more task-based like work environment. I guess like being a barista is task-based too, but it's like time-based as well, because you have a shift that ends. Like in production, you like leave when you're done. um and I think that was like a big adjustment for me, like on the schedule level. But it was also like pretty refreshing after having a chaotic schedule for like 4 years to go into something that was more like a stable work week, even though the volume would fluctuate from day to day. It helped that I had a really unique environment to learn how to roast in, because I was truly learning at a cafe that was just getting started. There were only like 2 or 3 baristas as well, and so it was like super close between the two. And I actually still worked like 1 shift a week as a barista while like managing the production. So it was super unique. It felt connected. So it was kind of like if there was one piece that was broken, it was all not working. And that was overwhelming, but I think it was also helpful because I learned how integral it should all be to each other.
So that's interesting, the idea of how, things are so interconnected. If one thing's not working, everything's not working. Is that different than how it works up front with working as a barista? Do you not, because it seems like the feedback of, oh, hey, something is wrong, like you're going to flag a problem really quick in the roastery versus up front, do problems get just covered up a lot more or allowed to continue? Is the feedback not as quick?
Yeah, I think it's like that in the cafe from my experience, but it's like where it goes beyond the cafe is kind of how it changes. Like for roasting, it's like immediately like this affects everything that we do. We have to figure it out. But I think what I meant when I was talking about that situation in particular is that like it went both ways. It was like if there was something happening with the team up front in the cafe, we felt it in the roastery. And I feel like I didn't necessarily expect that, even though it was all in one space, because that's not how it felt being on bar and knowing the roasting teams at other places that I worked. But there is like this thing that happens in cafes where I feel like the feedback gets contained in that space and doesn't necessarily get escalated when it needs to.
Oh, interesting. So the feedback getting escalated or just even drumming up the urgency to really take care of that thing. It seems like, there might be a little bit more focus on getting that taken care of in the back of house in the roastery than there would be up front necessarily. But now that you're in this position of back of house and in production, did you start to kind of think, oh, this is why the roasters were kind of like that when I was the trainer?
Yes, to a degree. I think I've definitely learned a lot about that perspective, just because like it is more difficult to fix a roast sometimes than it is to adjust a dial. But that said, like I still think it's really important for them to work together, and we do work pretty hard to do that at Andytown. Yeah, it's like yes and no.
Yeah, it's not as simple as just, this is absolutely the barista's fault, or the roaster. Yeah.
No, I think it's more like we kind of steer away from whose fault it is entirely. And it's more like, these are the suggested parameters, but like we expect your taste to rule out in the situation. And like if you taste something amazing at totally different parameters than what's suggested, like
Sure.
Please let us know. But that's much more our director of coffee quality and coffee sourcing and quality than it is my purview.
So once joining Andytown, you kind of went from assistant roles into directing roles into your current role pretty steadily. And I wanted to kind of ask about what the difference between being in those roles where, let's say that you were being taught a lot about what was going on, into roles then where you are directing and you are teaching others. When did that happen for you, and what was the biggest challenge in transitioning from a learning position to a directing position?
Honestly, in a lot of ways, it was easier for me to do that. Like, I say that with a huge grain of salt, because it is really difficult in a lot of ways, but I also feel like I really thrive in environments where I don't have a lot of structure to start with and have to build it. So I think I had a lot of room to grow and iterate, and I think if I had stepped into a super structured department, I'd probably have a really difficult time running it. Um and I've been lucky enough to have bosses who were in full support of me trying new things and calling into question some of the existing protocols that like no longer served us as we grew. And I also think that having a foundation and actually doing the tasks and workflows that I oversee now was really crucial in having compassion and like staying rooted in the value of creating good jobs. Ultimately, for me, that's in line with creating more efficiency rather than those two things being in conflict with each other, which I think people think that a lot. Someone could come in with a learning mindset and like gather that knowledge directly from a team without having had direct experience working in those jobs, for sure. But I personally learn better by doing.
Okay, so it's good that you had this opportunity to have people listen to your feedback, so you were getting some of your ideas installed into the systems even before you were in these directorial roles. And so I guess my next question would be about the systems themselves and what it is, because we're talking about how the cafe impacts what the roastery does, and the demands of your wholesale customers too, I guess, as well. And so there's all these inputs that are coming into the roastery that dictate how you shape the system. For you, how have you seen? What are the major components that are the forces that dictate how the roastery has to be set up to be efficient? I know the cafe, wholesale. What else is there, and how do you juggle all of those needs to create something that works for all of it?
It's difficult, and I think it's also like impossible in some ways. But I feel like this is something that I've carried with me from like the very first trainer that I had in coffee, and I do think it can be holistic between the cafe and the roastery side, and I've always kind of thought of it that way. My very first trainer in coffee, who's still my good friend, Monique, she taught me to delegate. And she had this mentality of like, start slow, get the details, and speed will come in time. And if you start out fast, you're not going to be able to get the details back. And I think like that is something that I have always trained to any job that I have, if whether I was training in the cafe or whether I was training in the roastery. I think that's one of the core principles. It fits into being system focused because like you can't delegate and give people the tools that they need to like do the job themselves if you're not if you're doing everything yourself and you're like overseeing everything yourself and doing all these like repetitive like thinking through solving the same problems over and over and over again without creating a system to catch those issues. I learned really fast that things felt like they were totally spinning out of control when I was trying to personally do too much or trying to remember to do too much. And now that I manage managers, I very much teach them the same thing of like, hey, if this is relying on you remembering it, that is not going to work. We have to figure out something else.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. What is it? David Allen of the book, Getting Things Done, says your brain's great for coming up with ideas, but not great for holding them.
Exactly. You're not going to have space. Like, I feel like, especially being in a directorial role, like I have to have space to like come up with ideas and think about big problems. And there is no space for that if I'm trying to remember to do this specific thing for this specific customer every week.
Right. And there's exceptions to your systems too, I suppose, that you need to manage where what I'm trying to think about is you have an obvious need to develop a system to catch a problem that's going to be a repetitive problem if not solved through a system. So it's maybe coming up with a better way to serve online orders, for example. But then there are other things that are very rare and things that you have to just kind of be creative with, but not necessarily develop a system for it, because it's not going to happen all the time. How do you tell the difference between things that need a permanent system and institution in the roastery, or things that are just exceptions to the rule that you don't necessarily need to systematize, but are nonetheless things that you need to manage?
Honestly, I think that is something that comes through conversation for me, because I am that person that has a tendency to create a system out of everything. And I have had to learn not to do that because, there are one-off exceptions. And I think it's like, it kind of goes back and forth. Like, I definitely rely on the two managers that I manage, to help me make those decisions. Like, we'll talk about it. They'll bring a problem to me and then I'll be like, oh, well, like, how often do you think this has happened or whatever? Or we'll get caught up in this conversation where we've already created a system and then they'll be like, wait a second, but this has only happened once in the last 6 months. And then we'll be like, oh, well, we can cross that bridge in the future. And, sometimes it just happens like that. And sometimes you spend the energy on it and then you're like, oh, that was silly. But I feel like that's how we learn. And luckily we catch ourselves doing that sort of thing most of the time before we like train an entire team on how to do it or something.
Yeah, that's a great idea, to just sort of have that conversational norm where you can catch yourselves, either one direction or another. Either we need to create a system or we don't. And if somebody every 6 months or every year wants you to fill 3-ounce bags of pre-ground coffee for their wedding gifts, it's not going to happen every week. So you may not need to designate inventory shelf space to tiny 3-ounce bags or something like that.
Exactly. And I think it's like there are definitely instances where we're like, I'm not sure if this needs a system or not. And then we'll be like, okay, let's keep an eye on it and just see if it comes up again.
Okay, so the need for a system is based on efficiency, yes, but what else is there that a system provides for the company and for the people?
Well, it reduces the number of times that we answer the same questions over and over again, or the number of times that someone on the team has to stop what they're doing and go and ask the same question over and over again. I also think it eliminates, doesn't eliminate, obviously, but it reduces the number of mistakes that we will make doing something that we, a process that we perform all the time. Like, we don't want to make mistakes on people's orders, like, regularly. So if we make the same mistake more, a few times in a row, we're like, okay, there needs to be a system for this so that it's not, like, so reliant on us remembering or us having the person who is the best person to pick the bags in the mailroom do that task every single time, because that doesn't make any sense. They're not going to be available to do that every time. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses, and we want to be able to make these processes as simple as possible for everyone.
So going back to the idea of managing a lot of different things that kind of inform what you do on a day-to-day basis, how do you keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening with the supply chain and keep informed about global logistics issues and all those other things that may mean that you need to spend a lot of time on the phone tracking down shipments, or may mean that you need to find or have a conversation with someone whose job it is to find other coffees to replace something that's stuck in port or something like that. What do you do to sort of stay on top of all those different areas of the supply chain that impact the logistics of the roastery?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think one of the lessons that me and Corazon, the other person that works with me on green buying, she does all the sourcing, we pivoted a lot and during the pandemic especially, and like tried really hard to stay on top of everything for a minute. But, you know, especially when I think we got a wake up call in that very early, because it was clearly impossible for us to like work on the floor in the roastery, which we were doing at that time, because of, you know, everyone just like during the shutdown.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, oh, we're going to cup coffee on the side real quick and then get back to like packing mail. And, you know, we were just running around so much that there wasn't time to like read all of the news that was happening and like all of the impacts. And, you know, then we went into a phase of like, okay, now we have a little bit more space. Let's like watch this webinar on like how the global supply chain is being impacted. And it was always the same answer. Like, no matter how unique the summary, like the synopsis was for the episode, it would be like, everything's delayed. Prepare as much as you can.
Stockpile.
Yeah. And so honestly, like we kind of developed, like, I guess you could say like a simplistic approach of just like, we're going to focus on our relationships and we're going to focus on doing as much in advance as possible. So we actually got pretty lucky when it comes to like our coffee menu strategy, because right before the pandemic happened, we had inherited like several contracts that there was just like too many bags of coffee on those contracts, and it was like manageable. Like we were going to be able to do it, but it meant, oh, like I don't think we're going to be able to buy as many things this year because we have too much to go through first. So it's like Corazon and I didn't really get the opportunity to implement our own strategy for buying with our current producers that first year. Instead, it was like, we're gonna be really lean on what we buy this year. We're gonna have that conversation with all of our producers, and then next year we'll be able to like buy more from each of them and have that be our new strategy, rather than, oh yeah, we'll taste whatever you want to bring us. And so we decided that we were going to have shorter periods of time where we run each coffee, so that like customers stay engaged, and also like we're, you know, it was kind of like, how do we buy within our means as a small business and make the best impact that we possibly can. So we were like, let's be good to the people that we have longstanding relationships with and try and buy more from them year over year, rather than like spreading ourselves thin or buying really heavy at the first quarter of the year and then not having any space to buy from folks whose harvest is later in the year. That strategy did us really well, because it meant that we weren't waiting for coffee to arrive so that it could go right on our menu. Instead, it was like, okay, I'm gonna add a couple bags as a cushion, but I'm not gonna overdo it. And because we're already going through these other contracts that we need to finish up this year, I don't know, I guess we did things ahead of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're forecasting based on history, but also there's this unknown because of the shakeup that doesn't give you as much confidence as you used to have in making these decisions, right?
Yeah, I think it was like in 2020 we were really lean, like we had already planned to do before the pandemic even hit, and obviously that ended up being good because we didn't know if we would make it to the next year. And then when 2021 hit, it was like, okay, things are picking back up again, and we went through the coffee that we needed to go through last year, and so now we can buy a bit more, and now there can be more of a cushion. And then this year it's more like, okay, let's back off a little bit again so that like we don't need to have quite as much of a cushion. But luckily it's been like we've been able to make those little adjustments and not had to like hard pivot, because we have like really good partners in the industry, and we can call them up and say, hey, like, can you help us find something for this spot in the menu? Like, and we'd much rather book something spot to fill a gap than like be waiting for something to like arrive at the port and then throw it in the roaster immediately. Like that's just so stressful for us and for our team. So if we can build it in and run that coffee like a little bit later when it has had time to arrive, like we're going to do that.
So you're already, before the pandemic, practiced in forecasting what you're going to need for the year, be based on, sales, based on what the cafe uses, and what your team can accomplish and not accomplish, right? So has any of that rhythm returned, a couple of years after 2020?
Forecasting, the act of forecasting hasn't really changed. Obviously, the actual coffee that I'm, the volume that I am predicting has changed a lot back and forth. In terms of like the process of going in and figuring it out, it hasn't changed too much because even before the pandemic, like we were growing like a lot. And so it was always like, okay, we're going to project a percentage of growth. It might be too much, it might be too little, and like, but it won't be so much or so little that we won't be able to figure something out. And I think that's kind of how I'm operating on it now too, is like last year I was like, okay, we're going to have a cafe that shut down during the pandemic reopen later this year. We're also going to have wholesale accounts coming back. Like, let's tack on a little bit more, but not so much that it's going to bite us later.
And that impacts your schedule too, right? In terms of how, if you need to hire somebody to help with production or how many days a week you're roasting, I mean, that factors in too as well,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
What does the average week look like for you in terms of, making time for numbers, people, and systems?
Yeah, so I laugh a little bit about that because it's hard to say that any week is normal. I feel like it's not. But at the same time, every week does involve me trying to find that balance. And I think there's like an ebb and flow to it, just like there is with all of production. The volume is going to change a little bit week to week, and my schedule changes a little bit week to week as a result of that. But there are some anchors. Like every week I find some time to work on longer term projects, whether it's like researching new equipment or, working with a designer on new packaging. That stuff is always unfortunately like the first thing to go if there's like an emergency that happens, but it's like, that's just kind of the way things are. If their roaster is broken, like I have to tend to that first. And then there's like anchor points, like my check-ins with Lauren, the owner, and my check-ins with Corazon, who I work with to buy coffee, and my managers, the production manager and wholesale manager. And so sometimes there's more quiet time than I have thought there was going to be, and I'm like, oh cool, I'm gonna take advantage of this and get some of these longer term projects going that have been on the back burner. And sometimes I'm fighting to have time to keep those projects on track. It's just kind of depends.
How do you determine what you're going to be working on for longer term projects? What informs the priorities?
Yeah, I think something that I've learned in this role in particular is that if I am spending too much time thinking about the details of the day-to-day stuff that's going on, really the things that I have hired other managers to do, I won't have the time and space to think through like bigger problems or plan out larger projects. And so one thing that I regularly do is when I have a big problem to solve or when I have a big project to like think through, I have to be outside of the roastery to like really have the time and space to like think through that. And usually I just kind of break it down of like, when do we need this by? And then I work backwards from there and figure out what steps there are. And of course there's like back and forth for that of like, oh, I missed a step. Like I need to like add this in or whatever. And there's always like a couple moments of scrambling for every project. But I do think, I've gotten pretty good at thinking about it systematically and also realistically for myself of like, okay, I have 20 projects on this list. There's no way that's going to happen. I'm going to have to break it down and figure out what I can actually accomplish like this year and what's going to have to be pushed to next year.
Okay. Are you inventing for yourself the needs of these projects? Like, oh, it'd be nice if we had a new roaster. I'm just gonna go and research a new roaster. Or is that a conversation you have with your team? Or is that something that's brought to you by somebody else that says, hey, we'd love for you to start doing some R&D on bag fillers or something like that? Like, how do those actually come into existence as projects?
Yeah, all of the above. So there are some things where I'm like, my job is to make sure that we're growing efficiently. And so sometimes it's like, oh, this is something cool to explore. If we like got this machine, it would make this task take less time, and then our team would be able to spend time on other things. Or, maybe the team is like saying, oh, we hate date stamping. Like, is there anything you can do about this process to make it better? And I'm like, let me see. And then sometimes, like Lauren and Michael will come in and they'll say, hey, like, we really want new 5-pound bags. Like, can you look into that? And can we try and have that happen next year? So it's like the long-term stuff. I'm definitely like planning that with Michael and Lauren and like making sure they're on the same page. And some of the ideas I come up with and some of them they come up with. And then I am definitely like in conversation with my managers who are in conversation with their team in terms of like implementation and like working out the details. But my priority list gets shaped by my managers too, like coming to me and saying like, hey, this has really been a problem lately. Like, what can we do about it? And, I'll try and figure it out.
Well, then a lot of times when you try to figure it out, sometimes it doesn't work out. And you can't, it's not a solution that's going to make people happy or not everybody happy, right? So how do you break the news? I mean, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think that I'm a pretty direct communicator. I feel like I've always appreciated it the most when people have been a straight shooter with me, and so I do my best to do that with them. And I think a lot more frustration comes from ambiguity than from just knowing like this is just the way things are, and doing my best to explain why. So that's kind of how I do it. That's how I did it when I directly managed the team, and that's how I do it with my managers now. And that's the expectation that I set for them in communicating with their team too.
I imagine you have a lot of history of successfully implementing fixes also.
Yeah, like little ones.
Oh, yeah, little ones or big ones where I'm just thinking it would be much easier to get a direct no from somebody like yourself, knowing that in the past you have worked tirelessly to just make my job a great job, rather than somebody who's just going to say no, but always says no and really doesn't have much proof of solving problems to make me feel better about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I definitely feel like that's true with my production manager Tony. He and I worked alongside each other like before I was a manager, but he's the only person really that's true for at this point. Like, our team has grown, and so most of the people that work on the team haven't seen me do that, or at least like half of them haven't seen me do that. So it's it's definitely not something that I take for granted, that people are just going to be like, oh, like Corey's done this before, so that, like, they know what they're doing. I don't know. I try not to let that intimidate me, but it is hard.
Yeah, I'll bet. Well, I want to ask, because there are people who, just like anybody who's been put in charge of a cafe as a manager, all of a sudden they find themselves in charge of a lot of different interlocking gears that make the cafe work, and it can be intimidating, and there are people out there who are rising in the ranks, so to speak, with roasting, and maybe a similar track as yourself. They are responsible for other people now and the logistics of the roastery. So talk to us a little bit about what your advice would be to them, of what kind of skills you think are necessary for them to develop, and some behaviors and habits that would really help them lay hold of this job and do well by the company and by their team?
Yeah. I mean, I think communication is absolutely the most important piece. Like listening to the people that you work for and the people that work for you, and doing your best to have a discussion. Not everything is up for discussion, but at the same time, like, it is the job of the manager to like hold some of the frustration and to hold and to explain why, and to like kind of do your best to bring the team with you into big changes, especially. And I think that it's super important to be able to go back and forth between the big picture and the details. Like, that's hard. I regularly get caught up in one or the other, and I have to pause and get my head back on straight before I make a decision. But I feel like I've also found that when I take the time to do that, my department and my projects always end up better for it.
Right. And it feels like you may at some point have to gain that clarity more aggressively for yourself. Like it seems like your relationship with the people you work with is very, very much based on mutuality and good communication. And sometimes there might be somebody working in your position who the owner is very silent, but verbally silent, but in their mind they have a lot of expectations and somewhat unfairly expect a lot from them, but don't communicate a lot with them. How do you navigate that when you're in charge, but the constraints that you have to operate within are not, they're not being forthright with that, and you need to determine for yourself the constraints and please your boss, but also run an efficient roastery?
For me, maybe I have like a unique situation in this, but I think for me, I have always foundationally been on the same page with the owners in terms of what is needed. And I think if that didn't make sense, it would honestly be really hard for me to do this job because, and there have been tons of times where I've had to like make a case for something to them, or vice versa, like explain something. Like, it doesn't, just because like me and the owners are on the same page about what way we're growing, definitely doesn't mean that the team is on up for that. Just being able to like explain how it will impact the day to day and why I think it's cool. You don't have to think it's cool, but this is where we're headed. And like, do you want that or do you not? Like, we're kind of down either way, but we'd love it if you're up for it. But sometimes it's not easy. I think it's harder in the small things than it is in the big things, and that's why I'm here and why I do what I do, is because the foundational things line up. But there's definitely like things in between where I have to really think through, like, what is my case for this, and why is it so important to me, or is it important to me? Do I want to like lose this battle? Am I okay with that? And there's definitely been both.
According to the values that you're aligned on, or that the company has, I guess.
Yes. I think where I say like I might be like lucky or have like a good situation is that like I can come to the owners and I can like make my case. And like I've also always been pretty determined in doing that. So I think like I probably would have done that whether they were open to hearing it or not. I just may not still be working there.
Oh man.
If they weren't receptive.
Well, I think it also makes a great case for owners out there who are putting people in the roastery in positions of authority and delegating to have the back of the people that they're putting in charge, and to do that by resourcing them with the clarity that I know that you enjoy in your position now, and may not be the case in every situation. But if you're an owner of a coffee shop and you've got somebody who's in that position, I know you need that support and you need that clarity, because logistics with all these different components relies on clarity of goals, right?
Yeah, I think it's super important. I mean, I have to learn this lesson all the time too, even though I'm not an owner. Like, we have to trust the people that we hire to do the jobs that they're set out to do. And I think it takes a lot of time to build that trust. especially when it's like the first time you've let something go, which is the thing in my case. You know, the owner was one of the owners, Michael, was very, very, very involved in roasting and production when I started. And like, it's just taken time of me like taking those things off of his plate and like figuring out how we were gonna have a better system. And the same thing is true with Lauren. Like she was super, super involved in wholesale, and like we've slowly been taking that on too.
Well, I guess my last question for you is around something a little bit more broad, and that is, you know, here at the Keys to the Shop, we definitely believe that what you do at Andytown and, you know, what anyone does as a barista, all of this collectively impacts the industry and in the end, the supply chain. And I want to ask you, how do you feel that roasters are, and doing the things that you do now with logistics and caring for your team and in production, how do you think that's uniquely positioned to contribute to a better supply chain, maybe a more equitable supply chain, just moving coffee forward?
There's definitely no easy answer to that. But I do feel like at the end of the day, like we have a lot of information that we're responsible for translating to customers, to the production team, and to the cafe teams, and we're also responsible for not overwhelming any of those folks like as best as we can, or making them feel like they have to follow like a set of rules in order to order coffee. Like that's a big one, and I think I've definitely been very happy to see the industry moving more towards like, oh, don't throw that coffee out just because it's 2 weeks old. Like it's still going to be delicious. Versus like, we're hard and fast on 2 weeks old or nothing. Like it's got to be less than 2 weeks old or it's totally undrinkable. Cause I just think that's not sustainable, and it's not honoring all the work that was put into that coffee by any stretch of the imagination. It's really difficult to hold those two things together, like that responsibility, but also like not wanting to overwhelm people or be intimidating. But I do think it's incredibly important to try and work on that, especially like as our reach at Andytown grows. You know, one small way that we've done that, obviously you could say that doesn't impact the entire supply chain, but me and Corazon have worked really hard to make production accessible to work in. Obviously it's a small team, and like it doesn't grow that fast as time goes on, but we have a growth track in place where like anybody can come from the cafe or come from outside of Andytown and like work as like a delivery driver, a production assistant, and like, you know, move through the steps to like becoming a roaster. It takes a lot of time, but you know, that pathway is there, and we understand that anyone can do that, and anyone should be able to like step in and do that.
Back to what you were talking about in the beginning of our conversation, where the Roastery always seemed like this shrouded club or mystery, and you're using your role and your influence to sort of make that better, and I love that.
Yeah, doing our best.
Awesome. Well, this was great. I love this conversation, and I think it really helps equip us with some practices that we can put in place to help us do these types of jobs better. And certainly you're doing a great job, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us on the show today. How can we stay in touch with you? How can do you have any like social or anything like that? How can we stay in touch?
Yeah, so you know, I work behind the scenes. This is like, I don't come out from behind the curtain very much, but this was great. You can definitely follow me on Instagram. My handle is at @COR_TADO, Cortado. Feel free to reach out.
Excellent. Corey, again, thank you so much. Really appreciate this.
Yeah, thank you. This has been awesome.
All right, everybody. I hope that you really enjoyed that conversation. If you find yourself in a similar position of taking on leadership within the production space, it seems to always boil down to relationships, right? Making sure that you are aware of the needs not only of different departments, but you're staying in contact with people in those departments, and you're doing what you can to provide a space that not only cares for the practical considerations of throughput in a production environment, but the people that are involved in that process as well. And obviously, Corey is doing a wonderful job in this role. So a huge thank you to Corey for joining us on today's show. If you want to stay in touch with Corey, you can be sure to follow the Instagram account at core, COR_Tato, like cortado. Get it? So go follow Corey there for sure. And I would also encourage you to listen to the linked episodes in the show notes, because we also talked with Lauren, one of the co-founders of Andytown Coffee Roasters, in a couple of episodes on the show in the past. And be sure to visit Andytown Coffee Roasters when you're in the Bay Area. Now, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback for me about today's episode, or any other episode of Keys to the Shop, really, just go ahead and email me, chris@keystotheshop.com. And that is also where you can reach me if you're interested in Keys to the Shop consulting, chris@keystotheshop.com. Now, you may or may not know, if you've been listening for a while, you do, that I am involved with Coffee Fest trade shows. I've been doing it since 2004. And they have been doing it since 1992. That's 3 decades of providing what, in my humble opinion, is the industry's best trade show to attend if you're looking to resource yourself and your team with the tools and insights to run a thriving coffee shop. Free and accessibly priced lectures, trainings, seminars, panel discussions. There's the trade show floor with the amazing vendors to supply your coffee house with the latest ingredients and equipment, wholesalers, etc., as well as competitions like the cold brew competition, latte art, of which for latte art I'm the head judge. And there's just a lot going on at Coffee Fest, and I really want you to be a part of it. So go ahead and visit them over at coffeefest.com to see what's up. You know, we're going to Los Angeles this month at the end of August, and then we're going to be going to Seattle in September, at the end of September. And if you want to get 50% off your registration for you and your team, you can use the code KEYS, as in Keys to the Shop, when you check out. So use the code KEYS, you get 50% off your registration. And I will be presenting lectures there. I'll be doing head judging at Latte Art, and also doing some live podcasting or recordings with presenters at my booth at each show. So do please find me, say hello, and just look for the yellow banner, the bald head, and good conversation, and I'll probably be there. So be sure to look into this. I want to see you there, coffeefest.com. And with that, that is the end of our episode today, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I appreciate all of you. Don't forget to subscribe to the show, rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, share this with your friends, and have an amazing day. And of course, as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.